Have you ever woken up drenched in sweat, heart pounding in your chest, from a nightmare so vivid it blurred the lines between what's real and what isn't? My name is Alaric Thorne, a historian with a penchant for uncovering the darkest secrets buried by time. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror that began to unfold one seemingly ordinary night. It started with a dream, or at least that's what I convinced myself it was. A dream so disturbingly real, it felt as if I had been dragged into another world entirely. A world where the dead still walked, and where the echoes of their screams could still be heard in the cold, desolate night. I'm about to share a story that has haunted me ever since. A tale that has left me questioning my own sanity. But before we descend into this abyss of fear and mystery, I urge you to prepare yourself. If you think you can handle the truth, if you believe you're brave enough to face what's coming, then hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Trust me, you're going to need every ounce of courage you have to make it to the end of this story. It was on a night much like this one, with the wind howling outside my window and the shadows in my room seeming to stretch and shift in unnatural ways. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine, as if something or someone was watching me. The last thing I remember before slipping into unconsciousness was the sound of my clock ticking, each second seeming to echo louder and louder in the silence, until it felt like a countdown to something dreadful. Then I found myself in a place that I had never seen before, but which felt disturbingly familiar. A ghost town in the middle of a vast, unforgiving desert. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the wind carried with it a low, mournful wail, like the cries of the long-dead souls who still lingered there. The buildings were old, their wood rotting and splintering, and the streets were eerily empty, devoid of any signs of life. Yet I could feel eyes on me, hundreds of them, hidden in the darkness, watching my every move. But here's the thing, this was no ordinary nightmare. There was something about this place, something that felt too real, too tangible. I could smell the dust and decay in the air. Feel the roughness of the sand beneath my feet. Hear the distant creak of old doors swaying in the wind. And then there was the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me. A feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Something that would change me forever. So, if you're ready to follow me into the depths of this terrifying mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the story I'm about to tell you is not just any story. It's a tale of horror, of the kind that seeps into your bones and stays with you long after the lights go out. And believe me when I say, what happened to me in that ghost town might just be the beginning of something much, much worse. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The kind of night where the world outside my window was still, almost unnervingly quiet. As I lay in bed, the weight of sleep began to pull me under, but not before a strange sensation crept over me. A feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in the darkness just beyond the reach of my vision. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing more than the remnants of a long day. But the moment my eyes closed, I was no longer in my bed. I was somewhere else entirely. I found myself standing in the middle of a desolate ghost town, bathed in the pale, sickly light of a full moon. The place was unsettlingly familiar, yet I knew I had never been there before. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a rancid, suffocating odor that clung to my nostrils and turned my stomach. The wind, cold and unforgiving, whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it a sound that chilled me to the bone. A low, almost imperceptible wail, like the distant cries of lost souls. As I took my first step, the ground beneath my feet crunched with the brittle remains of dead leaves and dry, cracked earth. Every sound echoed unnaturally in the vast emptiness, amplifying the sense of isolation that pressed down on me from all sides. The buildings around me were ancient, their wood warped and splintered, as if they had been left to rot for centuries. Windows were shattered, doors hung loosely from their hinges, and the entire town seemed to be slowly crumbling under the weight of time. But it wasn't just the sight of the decaying town that unnerved me. It was the oppressive atmosphere that weighed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadows here were different, darker, thicker, almost alive. They twisted and writhed at the edges of my vision, as if something within them was trying to break free, to reach out and drag me into the abyss. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and a cold sweat began to bead on my forehead. As I walked deeper into the town, the sense of déjà vu became overwhelming. I knew this place, though I couldn't recall how or why. It was as if the town itself had been etched into my memory, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The sensation was unnerving, like being caught in a loop of forgotten memories, each one more disturbing than the last. Then I noticed something strange, a scent that didn't belong. Amid the stench of decay, there was a hint of something else, something metallic and sharp, like the tang of blood. My heart began to race as I followed the scent, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. With each step, the smell grew stronger, more pungent, until it was almost overpowering. And then, there it was, a single drop of blood on the ground, dark and fresh, as if it had only just been spilled. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I touched the blood. It was warm, sticky, and for a moment, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. But what truly terrified me was the realization that this was no ordinary dream. The blood was real, the smell was real, the fear that gripped my heart was real. I wanted to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but I was trapped, unable to break free from whatever malevolent force had brought me here. In the distance, a sound broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like a door being pushed open by an unseen hand. I turned towards the source, and there it was, a building that seemed more intact than the others, with the door slightly ajar, light spilling out from within. The light was weak, flickering as if it came from a dying fire or a single struggling candle. Something about that door called to me, a sinister allure that I couldn't resist. My feet moved on their own, carrying me towards it even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back. As I approached, the door creaked open a little wider, as if inviting me in. The smell of blood was almost suffocating now, mingling with a strange, sweet aroma that made my head spin. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I was plunged into darkness, the weak light extinguished in an instant. And then, out of the blackness, a voice whispered my name, a voice that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien, as if it had been ripped from the deepest recesses of my mind. I knew then that this was no ordinary dream. It was something much worse, something that would haunt me long after I woke up, if I ever woke up at all. As I stood in the pitch-black room, the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin like an invisible force. My breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move or think, consumed by a primal fear that threatened to swallow me whole. Then, faintly at first, I began to notice the subtle sounds around me. The creak of old wood groaning under some unseen weight, the soft rustling of something moving in the darkness just beyond my reach. I wasn't alone in that room. There was something else with me, something that had been waiting for my arrival. My skin prickled with a cold sweat as I strained to see through the inky blackness, my eyes desperate for any source of light, any sign of what was lurking in the shadows. Slowly, my vision began to adjust, and I could make out the vague outlines of the room's interior. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with objects that looked like relics from another time. Old books with cracked spines, dusty glass jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and strange artifacts that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. But it was the mirror in the center of the room that drew my attention, its surface reflecting the faintest glimmer of light that seemed to come from nowhere. I approached the mirror cautiously, each step sending a jolt of unease through my body. The closer I got, the more distorted my reflection became. The face staring back at me was mine, but twisted, warped, as if the mirror was revealing some dark, hidden aspect of my soul. My eyes in the reflection were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull me in, drowning me in an abyss of despair. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the glass, but before I could make contact, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye made me spin around in terror. The room, which had seemed empty moments before, was now filled with shadowy figures. They stood silently, their forms barely visible, like silhouettes cut from the darkness itself. I couldn't make out any details, no faces, no eyes, just vague humanoid shapes that seemed to ripple and shift as if they were made of smoke. A cold dread settled in my gut as the figures began to move, slowly, methodically, circling me like predators closing in on their prey. I backed away, my hands fumbling against the rough surface of the shelves behind me. As I did, I knocked something over, and the sharp sound of shattering glass cut through the oppressive silence. The figures froze, their attention snapping toward the source of the noise. For a moment, the room was deathly still, and then, as if triggered by the sound, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged the air in front of me, and a deep, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through my bones. The mirror behind me began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The figures moved closer, their forms stretching and elongating in the flickering glow, becoming more monstrous with each passing second. I could feel the cold radiating from them, seeping into my bones, numbing my senses. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into full-blown panic, and I stumbled backward, desperate to escape. But the room seemed to close in around me, the walls tightening, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. The mirror's light intensified, and as I glanced back at it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection, but it wasn't me anymore. It was the distorted, hollow-eyed version of myself, grinning maniacally as it reached out from the glass, its fingers stretching toward me as if to pull me into the mirror's depths. I turned away, trying to shut out the image, but it was too late. The figures had closed in, their cold, smoky hands reaching for me, their touch like icy tendrils wrapping around my limbs, dragging me down. My vision blurred, my head spinning as the world around me dissolved into chaos. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the mirror shattering, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the room, followed by a scream, my own voice, distorted and twisted, merging with the darkness. When I finally opened my eyes, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, the darkness of the room pressing in on me. The familiar surroundings should have brought relief, but they didn't. The echoes of the dream, or whatever it had been, lingered, the fear still gnawing at my insides. I wanted to believe it was over, just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew that what I had experienced was far more than that. The memory of those cold, shadowy figures and the broken mirror haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back into the waking world. The clock on my bedside table read 3:33 a.m., the same time as in my dream. The air was heavy, thick with the same oppressive dread that had filled the room in the ghost town. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it, the low, mournful wail of the wind, just as I had heard it in that place. It was outside my window, a haunting reminder that the nightmare wasn't just in my mind. It was real, and it was only just beginning. The room around me was a swirling vortex of chaos and darkness, the shadows dancing with a malevolent energy that seemed to pulse with life. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drumbeat of terror as I struggled to make sense of the nightmarish scene unfolding before my eyes. The mirror that had once stood whole and menacing in the center of the room was now shattered, its jagged pieces scattered across the floor, each shard reflecting fragments of a reality that no longer made sense. In the center of this storm of madness, something began to emerge from the darkness, a figure, grotesque and twisted, born from the very essence of fear. It was the same figure I had glimpsed in the mirror, but now it was fully formed, a perverse reflection of myself. yet something far more sinister. Its eyes were voids of blackness, endless and consuming, as if they were portals to some nightmarish dimension where light could not exist. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, a hideous parody of a smile that sent a shiver of pure dread down my spine. As I stared in horror, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the room as if reality itself was bending to accommodate this abomination. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the thing that now stood just inches away from me. Then, with a suddenness that left me gasping, the figure lunged. Its icy, spectral hand shot out, fingers like talons digging into my chest. Not physically, but with a force that seemed to reach inside my very soul. The pain was excruciating, a burning cold that spread through my body, freezing me from the inside out. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into a haze of agony and despair. I could feel it. This creature, this dark reflection, was trying to take something from me, something vital, something that defined who I was. In that moment of pure terror, I realized what it was after. It wasn't just my life it wanted, it was my identity, my essence, my very existence. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was an invasion, a battle for my soul. The creature wanted to replace me, to become me, to step out of the shadows and into the light of the waking world, using my body as its vessel. With a surge of adrenaline, I fought back, struggling to break free from its grasp. My hands, trembling and weak, reached out instinctively, grabbing at the nearest object, a piece of the shattered mirror. The shard was sharp, jagged, a weapon born of desperation. With every ounce of strength I had left, I plunged the shard into the creature's chest, expecting to meet resistance. But instead, it passed through as if the creature was made of smoke and shadow. The figure recoiled, its black eyes narrowing in a look of pure malice. The grin never faltered, but the shadows around it seemed to waver, as if my defiance had disrupted its hold on this reality. For a brief moment, the darkness in the room lifted, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind the creature, where the shadows parted, was a doorway. It was the same door I had seen earlier, slightly ajar, with a faint, unnatural light spilling out. But now, I could see what lay beyond. It wasn't just another room. It was a void, an abyss of swirling darkness and malevolent energy, a gateway to somewhere else, somewhere that defied all logic and reason. The realization hit me like a wave of ice-cold water. This place, this nightmare, wasn't just in my mind. It was real, and that doorway was the only escape, or perhaps a passage to something far worse. The creature lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. I dodged to the side. Feeling its cold grasp miss me by inches, I ran toward the door, driven by a primal need to survive, to escape this nightmare before it consumed me entirely. The light from the doorway flickered, growing brighter as I approached, but with it came a new sense of dread. What if stepping through that door wasn't salvation? What if it was the final plunge into oblivion? But I had no choice. The creature was behind me, its presence a suffocating force that threatened to drag me back into the darkness. With a final desperate push, I threw myself through the doorway, into the light, into whatever awaited on the other side. The transition was violent and jarring, like being ripped from one reality and thrust into another. I felt myself falling, tumbling through a void, the light around me distorting and warping until it was nothing but a blur. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. I was back in my room, lying on my bed, the familiar surroundings, a stark contrast to the horror I had just experienced. But something was wrong. The room was exactly as I had left it, but the air was thick with that same oppressive dread. I could hear the distant sound of my clock ticking, and when I looked over, the time was frozen at 3:33 a.m. My heart sank as I realized that I hadn't truly escaped. The nightmare had followed me back, and it wasn't over. The faint sound of a low, sinister chuckle echoed in the darkness of my room, sending a chill down my spine. And then I saw it, in the corner of my room where the shadows gathered the thickest. The figure stood watching me, grinning, its black eyes locked onto mine. It hadn't just followed me back, it was here to stay. The nightmare had become my reality, and I was trapped in its grip, unable to wake up, unable to escape the darkness that now consumed my life. The next morning, I woke with a start, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to me like a second skin. My head pounded, my thoughts clouded by the memory of the figure with hollow eyes, the shattered mirror, and that impossible doorway to the void. But as I sat up in bed, trying to shake off the lingering terror, I realized something was off. The air in my room was thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding that felt all too real. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, as if they were hiding something just beyond my sight. The clock on my bedside table still read 3:33 a.m., the numbers glowing faintly in the dim light of the early morning. I knew I had slept for hours, yet the time hadn't changed. A chill ran down my spine as I reached for my phone, desperate for some sign of normalcy. But when I checked the time, it too was stuck at 3:33 a.m. The device flickered in my hand, the screen glitching momentarily before returning to that same cursed time. Panic began to rise within me. This wasn't just a nightmare. Something had followed me back, something that was determined to keep me trapped in its grasp. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening to me before it was too late. Driven by an overwhelming sense of urgency, I threw on some clothes and rushed to my desk, where I kept my research notes and books. As a historian, I had spent years studying ancient texts, forgotten places, and the mysteries of the past. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for this, a nightmare that had seeped into the fabric of my reality. My hands trembled as I flipped through pages, searching for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. That's when I found it. An old tattered book I had acquired years ago, almost forgotten among the piles of research materials. The cover was faded, the title barely legible, but something about it called to me, much like the doorway in the dream. I opened the book, my fingers trembling, and began to read. The pages were filled with strange symbols, ancient runes that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. As I skimmed through the text, one word caught my eye: Erebus. The name sent a shiver down my spine, stirring a memory I couldn't quite place. I read further, and the more I learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Erebus was an ancient entity, a force of darkness older than time itself. According to the book, Erebus had the power to invade dreams, to twist reality and feed on the fear of those it ensnared. The entity was said to dwell in the void between worlds, using mirrors and shadows as gateways to reach into the minds of the living. Those who encountered Erebus often found themselves trapped in a cycle of nightmares, unable to distinguish between what was real and what was an illusion. Many who had fallen victim to Erebus had vanished without a trace, their souls consumed by the entity, leaving nothing behind but an echo of their terror. A sense of dread settled over me as I realized that my dream hadn't been just a figment of my imagination. It was Erebus reaching out, pulling me into its dark domain, and now it had crossed over into my world, determined to drag me back into the abyss. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time Erebus had targeted me. There was something familiar about the entity, a sense that it had been lurking in the shadows of my life for far longer than I realized. I searched my memory, trying to recall any past encounters, and then it hit me. A long-forgotten incident from my childhood. When I was 10 years old, I had a recurring nightmare that lasted for weeks. I would find myself in a dark room surrounded by shadows that whispered my name. There was a mirror in the room, and in that mirror, I would see a figure standing behind me, tall, faceless, and terrifying. The dream always ended the same way. The figure would reach out, its hand closing around my shoulder, and I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. My parents had dismissed the nightmares as just a phase, but they had left a lasting impact on me. I had forgotten about them over the years, but now, as I pieced together the events of the past and the present, I realized that Erebus had been with me all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. Desperate for more information, I continued to dig deeper into the book, and what I found was even more disturbing. Erebus was known to target those who had encountered it before, using their past fears as a foothold to gain control over their minds. The entity fed on fear, growing stronger with each nightmare it induced, until it had enough power to manifest in the real world. The book warned that once Erebus had a hold on you, there was no escape. It would haunt you until it had consumed your very soul. I couldn't let that happen. I had to find a way to break free from Erebus's grasp before it was too late. The book mentioned a ritual, a way to sever the connection between the entity and its victim, but the instructions were vague, the text obscured by age and decay. I would need to do more research, find the missing pieces of the puzzle, but time was running out. The longer I waited, the stronger Erebus would become, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the nightmare returned. But then, as I was about to close the book, a loose page slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, my heart racing as I read the words scrawled across it in faded ink. It was a warning, written by someone who had faced Erebus before, someone who had come close to escaping but had failed. The message was simple, but it filled me with a sense of dread like no other. The mirrors are the key. They are the gateways. Break them all before it's too late. The words echoed in my mind as I looked around my room, my gaze falling on the mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection stared back at me, but this time I couldn't tell if it was truly my own. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what I had to do. If Erebus was using the mirrors as gateways, then destroying them might be my only chance to sever the connection and escape its clutches. But there was one problem. I had no idea how many mirrors Erebus had already infiltrated or how deep its influence had spread. For all I knew, every reflective surface in my home could be a gateway to the void, and smashing them might only anger the entity further. But I couldn't let fear paralyze me. Not now, not when my very soul was at stake. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox under my bed, my hands shaking as I approached the mirror. My reflection wavered, the image in the glass distorting as if something was trying to break free. With a surge of determination, I raised the hammer and brought it down with all my strength. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting fragments of the room and of the figure that had been lurking in the darkness. But as the glass broke, I felt a shift in the air, a release of pressure that I hadn't realized had been building. The room was silent, the oppressive dread that had filled it moments ago dissipating, leaving behind a sense of eerie calm. I wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot, but this was the first step in a battle I knew would be long and perilous. I had faced Erebus before and survived, but now it was back, more determined than ever to claim me as its own. The connection between the nightmare and reality had been made clear, and I knew that if I wanted to escape, I would need to uncover the full truth of my past and find a way to banish Erebus once and for all. But time was running out, and the next move was Erebus's to make. The shattered glass on the floor seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the remnants of the mirror still holding a connection to the void. And as I stared at the broken shards, a new fear gripped my heart. What if destroying the mirrors wasn't enough? What if Erebus had already found another way in? As the pieces of the shattered mirror lay scattered on the floor, glinting ominously in the dim light, a deep sense of unease settled over me. The brief moment of calm that had followed the destruction of the mirror was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread that something far worse was on the horizon. I knew that smashing the mirror was only the beginning, but the full scope of what I was facing was still shrouded in mystery and fear. The entity, Erebus, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike, and with every passing minute, I could feel its presence growing stronger, more palpable, as if it was feeding off my fear. Determined to find answers, I decided to confront the source of my nightmare head-on. I packed a bag with essential supplies, a flashlight, extra batteries, a notebook to document my findings, and the ancient book that had given me the first clues about Erebus. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, twisted shadows across my room. The time had come to face the ghost town from my dream, the place where all of this had begun. My mind raced with questions. Was it real? Was there truly a place where Erebus had established a foothold in our world? And if so, what horrors awaited me there? As I left my house and drove through the darkening landscape, the sense of isolation grew more profound with each passing mile. The road was desolate, the trees on either side twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to ensnare me. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, with clouds swirling ominously, as if nature itself was warning me to turn back. But I pressed on, the pull of the ghost town growing stronger, guiding me toward the unknown. After what felt like hours of driving, the landscape began to change. The trees thinned out, replaced by stretches of barren desert. The ground cracked and dry. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay that I had first encountered in my dream. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally caught sight of the town in the distance, an eerie, silent place that seemed frozen in time, just as I had seen it in my nightmare. As I parked the car and stepped out, the full weight of the town's oppressive atmosphere bore down on me. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it that same mournful wail I had heard before. The buildings stood in silent decay, their wood rotting and splintered, windows broken, doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming, as if I had been here 1,000 times before, trapped in a never-ending loop of terror. I approached the first building cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. The interior was just as I had imagined it, dusty, filled with the remnants of a life long abandoned. Old furniture lay broken and scattered, cobwebs draped across every surface. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed in the dream. Symbols. Strange, ancient symbols were carved into the walls, etched into the wood and stone, their patterns intricate and unsettling. The symbols pulse with a faint malevolent energy, as if they were alive, watching me. As I moved deeper into the building, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. The shadows here were darker, more tangible, as if they were waiting to swallow me whole. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Something shifting in the darkness just beyond the beam of light. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. Then I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a voice, or perhaps many voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a taunt, a cruel mockery, as if the very walls of the building were laughing at my fear. My skin crawled as the whispering grew louder, more insistent, the words becoming clearer. "They are coming." The voices hissed, sir. A wave of panic surged through me, and I spun around, desperate to find the source of the voices. But the room was empty, save for the flickering shadows that seemed to close in on me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing as the walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker, more suffocating. I had to get out, but the way back was lost, swallowed by the inky blackness that now filled the building. In a desperate bid to escape, I stumbled through the room, my hands brushing against the cold, rough surfaces of the walls, the symbols burning against my skin. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more frenzied, until they were a cacophony of voices screaming in my ears. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I was trapped, lost in a maze of shadows and voices, with no way out. Then, out of the darkness, I saw it. A faint glow, the same unnatural light I had seen in my dream. It was coming from a doorway at the far end of the room, just as it had before. The light pulsed rhythmically, beckoning me, drawing me toward it with an almost hypnotic pull. I knew that whatever lay beyond that door was dangerous, but I had no other choice. It was the only way out, the only chance I had to escape the clutches of Erebus. With trembling hands, I reached for the door and pushed it open. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, as I stepped through the threshold. But what I saw on the other side was beyond anything I could have imagined. The room was vast, impossibly large, its walls lined with mirrors, hundreds of them, each one reflecting the same twisted image of myself that I had seen in my dream. The mirrors were arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center of the room stood an altar, ancient and covered in more of those strange symbols. The air was thick with the scent of blood, and on the altar lay an object that made my blood run cold, a mirror shattered into pieces, just like the one I had destroyed in my bedroom. But this mirror was different. The shards were covered in dark, viscous fluid that I instinctively knew was not of this world. As I approached the altar, the mirrors around me began to ripple, their surfaces distorting as if something was trying to break free. My reflection twisted and contorted in the glass, my face merging with that of the creature I had seen before, the hollow-eyed figure that had haunted my nightmares. The air crackled with dark energy, and I could feel Erebus's presence growing stronger, more tangible, as if it was about to break through the barrier between our worlds. Desperation clawed at my mind. I had to stop this, had to find a way to sever the connection before Erebus could fully manifest. My gaze fell on the shards of the mirror on the altar, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. The mirrors were the key, the gateways through which Erebus was trying to enter our world. If I could destroy them, I might be able to weaken the entity, or at least buy myself some time. But as I reached for the shards, the mirrors around me exploded, sending fragments of glass flying in all directions. The room was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that was both a scream and a laugh as the shadows around me came alive, swirling in a frenzy of darkness. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet begin to tremble. Erebus was here, fully manifested, and there was no turning back. The shadows coalesced into a towering figure, its form shifting and writhing as it took shape. The hollow-eyed face loomed over me, a grin of pure malice stretching across its twisted features. The mirrors reflected the creature from every angle, trapping me in a nightmare of infinite reflections, each one more horrifying than the last. I could feel the darkness closing in, the shadows reaching for me, ready to drag me into the void. My heart raced, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I realized that this might be the end. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. Erebus had me, and it wasn't going to let go. But then, in the midst of the chaos, I remembered the book, the ancient text that had warned me about Erebus, the same book that had fallen open to reveal the message about the mirrors. With a surge of determination, I pulled the book from my bag and flipped to the last page, the one with the cryptic warning. The words were faint, almost illegible, but as I read them aloud, the shadows recoiled, hissing in fury. The book trembled in my hands, the pages glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. The symbols on the altar began to pulse in time with the light, growing brighter and brighter until they were almost blinding. Erebus let out a roar of anger, the sound reverberating through the room, shaking the very foundation of the building. The mirrors shattered one by one, the glass dissolving into dust as the light from the book intensified. The creature writhed in agony, its form flickering and distorting as the power of the book began to take hold. The shadows retreated, and I could feel the air grow lighter, the oppressive dread lifting as Erebus's hold on this world weakened. But I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The connection between Erebus and our world was still there, tenuous but unbroken. The light from the book was fading, and I could feel the entity's presence beginning to resurface, stronger and more determined than before. With a final desperate effort, I raised the book high and slammed it down onto the altar. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and the mirrors exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The ground shook violently, and I was thrown backward, my vision going dark as the world around me dissolved into chaos. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground, the room around me silent and still. The mirrors were gone, the altar shattered, and the air was clear, free of the oppressive dread that had hung over me. But I knew that Erebus wasn't gone. Not completely. It had been weakened, but the connection was still there, and as long as that connection remained, I would never be truly safe. As I stood up, the last remnants of the book crumbled to dust in my hands. The final barrier between me and Erebus destroyed. I was alone now, with no protection, no way to keep the entity at bay. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Erebus would return, and when it did, I would have to be ready. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, but I was determined to find a way to sever the connection for good. I would delve deeper into the mysteries of Erebus, uncover the truth behind its origins, and find the key to banishing it from our world forever. But as I walked out of the ghost town, leaving the shattered remnants of my nightmare behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Erebus was watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And when it did, I would be ready. Because this time, I wouldn't be fighting just for my soul, but for the very fabric of reality itself. As I emerged from the ghost town, the night sky above me was vast and empty, a black void that seemed to stretch into infinity. The stars, once comforting and familiar, now appeared distant and cold, like the eyes of 1,000 watching specters. The wind whipped through the deserted streets behind me, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. I knew that this was far from over, that Erebus was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. With every step I took away from that cursed place, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at me only intensified. The destruction of the mirrors and the shattering of the altar had weakened Erebus, but the connection between us was still there, like a dark thread binding our fates together. I could feel its presence growing stronger, more insidious, as if it was regrouping, preparing for one final desperate attempt to claim my soul. My thoughts raced as I drove back through the barren desert, the landscape around me shifting in the moonlight, taking on a twisted, almost surreal quality. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, and with each passing mile, I became more aware of a subtle change in the air, a thickening of the atmosphere, a rising tension that prickled my skin and set my nerves on edge. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, fraying at the edges as Erebus's influence seeped into the world. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw it, a dark figure standing in the middle of the road, its silhouette stark against the pale glow of the morning sky. My heart lurched in my chest as I recognized the shape, the hollow-eyed figure that had haunted my dreams, the twisted reflection of myself that had emerged from the mirrors. Erebus had found me again, and this time, it wasn't waiting in the shadows. It had come to confront me directly, to finish what it had started. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just a few feet from the figure. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I stared into the black voids that were its eyes. There was no escape now, no turning back. Erebus had brought the fight to me, and I knew that this was the moment of truth, the final confrontation that would determine whether I would survive or be consumed by the darkness. As I stepped out of the car, the world around me seemed to warp and distort, the sky darkening, the desert landscape twisting into a nightmarish version of itself. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it might crumble away at any moment, plunging me into an abyss. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and freezes your soul. Erebus stood motionless, its gaze fixed on me, its presence radiating an aura of malevolence that made it hard to breathe. The entity was no longer a mere shadow, but a fully formed creature of darkness, its body a shifting mass of shadows and smoke, constantly changing shape as if it couldn't hold a single form for long. Its face was a mockery of my own, twisted into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged black teeth. "I've been waiting for you," the creature whispered, its voice a low, hissing echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've run long enough. Now, it's time to end this." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, but also a spark of defiance. I wasn't going to let Erebus win, not without a fight. I reached into my bag and pulled out the last remaining shard of the mirror from the ghost town, the only piece I had managed to salvage before fleeing. The glass was sharp and cold in my hand, the surface still stained with the dark fluid that had oozed from the altar. It was my only weapon, my last hope of severing the connection between us and banishing Erebus back to the void from which it had come. Erebus's grin widened as it saw the shard, its eyes narrowing in anticipation. The air around us crackled with dark energy, the ground trembling as the entity prepared to strike. I could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on me, the shadows closing in. But I held my ground, refusing to back down. "Do you really think that will stop me?" Erebus taunted, its voice dripping with contempt. "I am older than time itself. I am the darkness that lurks in every shadow, the fear that haunts your every nightmare. You cannot defeat me." But I knew that I had no choice. It was either fight or be consumed, and I wasn't ready to give in. With a surge of determination, I lunged forward, the shard raised high, ready to strike. Erebus moved with inhuman speed, its form shifting and twisting as it lashed out at me, tendrils of darkness whipping through the air. I barely managed to dodge the first strike, the tendrils grazing my arm and leaving a searing pain in their wake. But I didn't stop. I couldn't afford to. I swung the shard with all my strength, aiming for the heart of the creature, hoping against hope that it would be enough. The shard connected, sinking deep into the swirling mass of shadows that made up Erebus's form. For a moment there was silence, the world holding its breath as the shard pulsed with a blinding light. Erebus let out a shriek of rage, the sound reverberating through the air, shaking the ground beneath us. The light from the shard intensified, spreading through the creature's body, burning away the darkness, forcing it to retreat. But Erebus wasn't finished yet. As the light grew brighter, the creature's form began to break apart, the shadows peeling away like layers of rotting flesh. But in its final moments, Erebus lashed out one last time, its tendrils of darkness wrapping around me, pulling me into a crushing embrace. I felt the cold, suffocating presence of the void pressing in on me, dragging me down into the abyss. I struggled, fighting with every ounce of strength I had left, but the darkness was overwhelming, a weight too heavy to bear. The light from the shard began to dim, the energy draining away as Erebus's grip tightened, crushing the life out of me. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, the edges of my vision darkening, my thoughts slowing as the void threatened to swallow me whole. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, the shard flared to life one last time, a brilliant, blinding burst of light that shattered the darkness. Erebus let out a final, agonized scream as the light consumed it, the shadows dissolving into nothingness, leaving behind only the faintest echo of its presence. The tendrils loosened their grip, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the world around me returned to normal. The sky was clear, the sun beginning to rise over the horizon, bathing the desert in a warm, golden glow. The road was empty, the ghost town far behind me, and Erebus was gone, banished back to the void from which it had come. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling with exhaustion, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The shard lay beside me, now nothing more than a piece of broken glass, its power spent, but the connection was severed. Erebus was gone, and I was free. But as I looked up at the sky, a cold realization settled over me. Erebus might have been banished, but the darkness it had left behind was still there, lurking at the edges of my mind. waiting for the right moment to return. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. I had faced the darkness and survived, but I knew that it would always be with me, a shadow that would never fully disappear. And as I stood up, the dawn breaking around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The nightmare might be over for now, but the darkness would always be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to strike again when I least expected it. Because in the end, the darkness is always watching, always waiting. And no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you fight, it will always find a way back. In the days following the final confrontation with Erebus, I struggled to return to a semblance of normalcy. The sunlit mornings, once a source of comfort, now felt eerily hollow, as if they were merely a veneer masking the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface of my reality. Though Erebus had been banished, the experience had left me profoundly changed, my sense of safety shattered, my world forever tinged with the shadow of what I had encountered. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was truly over, that the nightmare had ended with the breaking of the connection. I resumed my daily routines, hoping that the familiarity would help me forget the horrors I had faced. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories clung to me like a persistent fog, blurring the lines between what was real and what was not. The nights were the worst. Sleep became an elusive prey, each attempt to rest haunted by the lingering fear that Erebus might return. Even the smallest noise, a creak of the floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside my window, sent waves of anxiety crashing over me. I would lie awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for the first hint of movement, the first whisper of that sinister voice. And then, strange things began to happen. Small at first, but enough to unsettle me. It started with the mirrors in my house. I had destroyed every mirror I could find after returning from the ghost town, but reflections still found their way into my life. The surface of a polished spoon, the sheen of a glass window, even a puddle of water. They all seemed to hold something just beyond the reach of sight, something dark and foreboding. At times, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow that wasn't mine, lurking in the periphery. But it wasn't just the mirrors. There were other signs too, subtle, insidious reminders that Erebus's presence had not been fully eradicated. Objects in my house would move on their own, just a few inches, barely noticeable unless you were paying close attention. Doors that I was certain I had closed would be found ajar, and I would hear faint, indistinct whispers in the dead of night, voices that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. One night, as I was reviewing my research notes, trying to find some explanation, some reassurance that it was all over, I stumbled upon something I had missed before, a passage in the ancient book that had guided me to Erebus. It was a warning, scrawled in the margins by a previous owner, someone who had faced the same terror I had. The words were chilling in their simplicity. The darkness never truly leaves. It waits, biding its time, growing stronger in the shadows, and when it returns, it will be more powerful than before. A cold dread settled over me as I read those words. Could it be true? Had Erebus merely retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again? The thought gnawed at me, filling my every waking moment with a growing sense of paranoia. I started to see signs of Erebus everywhere, in the way the shadows stretched and elongated at dusk, in the unsettling quiet of the forest behind my house, in the sudden chill that would sweep through a room without warning. One night as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on glass. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the window beside my bed. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head to look. There, in the reflection of the window, I saw it. The same hollow-eyed figure standing just outside, its twisted grin stretching impossibly wide, its black voids of eyes staring directly into mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, unable to move. unable to look away. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, the figure unmoving, a mockery of my own reflection. Then, in a blink, it was gone, the window reflecting nothing but the darkness of the night outside. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed to the window, throwing it open. The night was silent, the air cold and still. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest that the figure had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen. Erebus was not gone. It had found another way in, another gateway through which it could torment me. The final confrontation had not been the end. It was merely a pause, a momentary reprieve before the darkness resumed its relentless pursuit. Desperation clawed at my mind. I had to do something, anything, to stop this before it consumed me entirely. I turned to the ancient book once more, searching for answers, for some way to seal Erebus away for good. But the more I read, the more I realized the terrifying truth. There might be no way to truly destroy Erebus. It was a force of nature, an entity that thrived on fear and darkness, always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. I began to consider the unthinkable, that I might have to leave everything behind, abandon my life, and disappear into the wilderness, far away from any mirrors, any reflective surfaces that could serve as a gateway for Erebus. But even then, would it be enough? Could I ever truly escape a force that seemed to defy the very laws of reality? The terror and uncertainty gnawed at me day and night until I was a shadow of my former self, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting Erebus to be there, just out of sight, waiting to pull me back into the nightmare. And so, as I sit here now, writing these words, I can't help but wonder, how much time do I have left? How long before Erebus finds a way to fully manifest in our world once more? How long before I'm dragged back into the darkness, this time for good? I've told you my story, but it's far from over. The darkness is still out there, waiting, watching. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. So I urge you, be careful. Watch the shadows, avoid the mirrors, and if you ever feel that cold, creeping dread settling over you, know that Erebus might be closer than you think. If you've made it this far, then you're braver than most. But remember, bravery doesn't protect you from the darkness. It only delays the inevitable. So if you value your safety, your sanity, heed my warning. Keep your lights on, stay vigilant, and never, ever look too long into a mirror. Because sometimes the nightmares don't end when you wake up. Sometimes they're just beginning. If you found this story as chilling as I did living it, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this with anyone who might be intrigued, or perhaps just maybe in need of a warning. The darkness is always out there, and it's always watching. Don't let it catch you unprepared.